Welcome to the Golden Gems podcast. Today we're taking a deep dive into Gil Scott-Heron and the uncompromising life of the bluesologist who warned us the revolution would be live.
It really is quite a journey to look back on.
It is. I mean, here we are in 2026. We are looking back 15 years since his passing on May 27, 2011.
Right, at St. Luke's Hospital in New York.
Exactly. And yet, if you listen to his catalog today, his ghost is arguably louder than ever. I mean, we find ourselves living in the exact algorithmic, static-filled, hyper-commercialized world that he mapped out for us decades ago.
It's uncanny. It's almost unsettling how accurate his foresight was. But to truly understand the scope of his work and why it still resonates so deeply with you today as a listener, you have to completely discard the simple labels that history often tries to stick on him.
Usual boxes, right?
Yeah, exactly. He wasn't just a rapper. He wasn't just a jazz singer or a poet. He actually assigned himself a highly specific, almost scientific designation. He called himself a bluesologist.
A bluesologist. So he was treating the blues not just as a genre of music, but as an actual field of study.
Precisely. He approached the blues as a comprehensive historical system of survival and of sociological reportage. He wasn't just playing a standard 12-bar chord progression. He was literally taking the debris of the past, the struggles, the systemic realities, and using them to construct a meticulously detailed archive of the future.
And that really is the mission of our deep dive today. We want to trace the exact fault line his work carved through American music and political thought. And to do that, you really have to start with the geography of his early life.
Because it completely forged his perspective.
It did. He was born in Chicago on April 1st, 1949, and his childhood was defined by this profound parental void. His mother, Bobby Scott, was an opera singer of immense intellect, but his father, Gil Heron, was entirely absent.
And, his father wasn't just anybody.
No, not at all.
Gil Heron was known as the Black Arrow. He was a celebrated Jamaican footballer who played for Celtic FC. So you have this dynamic where his father was a literal hero on the pitch in Scotland, but an absolute ghost in his own home in Chicago.
Which leaves a massive vacuum.
A huge one. And if you look at Gil Scott-Heron's entire life, you see a man attempting to fill that vast empty space with rhythm and language.
And because of that parental separation, he doesn't stay in Chicago. He's sent down to Jackson, Tennessee to live with his grandmother, Lily Scott. This migration completely defines his voice. If you're listening to this and trying to decode the percussive, unapologetic nature of his later work, you just cannot do it without understanding the oppressive reality of Tennessee in the 1950s.
You really can't. We need to strip away any cinematic Hollywood romanticism of the Deep South here. For a young black boy in the 1950s, this environment was a crushing physical and psychological weight. It was defined by the relentless, suffocating humidity of the Mississippi Delta and the constant, unspoken threat of systemic violence. But within that pressure cooker, his grandmother, Lily Scott, provided his foundational psychological structure.
Because she was a fierce civil rights activist herself.
She was. And she recognized something crucial for him. She saw that physical liberation requires intellectual liberation. She actually brought him a piano. She was teaching him, very early on, that music is not a toy. It is a mechanism for survival.
And that specific teaching is put to the ultimate test when he becomes one of only 3 black children chosen to integrate a local white school in Jackson. Now, historically, we often look back at integration as this triumphant milestone, right?
Right, the textbook narrative.
Exactly. But we have to look at this strictly through the clinical framing of his own lived experience. From his perspective, this wasn't a victory parade. He viewed it as a tactical deployment of children into a war zone.
Tactical deployment into a war zone. That is the exact phrase for it. I mean, imagine being that young, walking through those hallways and absorbing the reality that the local white population views you as a biological contaminant.
It's horrifying.
Absorbing those daily slurs. The sheer hostility, it forced him into a state of hard forensic observation. He had to dissect the mechanics of white psychology and systemic racism simply to navigate his walk to the classroom safely.
He's basically taking notes just to survive the day.
Precisely. And from his sociological viewpoint, he began to see this mechanical racism not as an anomaly or a glitch, but as a functioning gear in the machinery of the American experiment. That experience completely stripped away his innocence and forged the analytical, unsparing worldview that defines his writing.
But then at age 12, his grandmother passes away. His anchor is lost. And this triggers a second great migration, this time moving north to the Bronx to live with his mother. You have to imagine the sensory shock here. You're going from the terrifying, slow silence of the segregated South to the chaotic, working-class noise of the Bronx in the early 1960s.
It's a massive shift.
And if that wasn't jarring enough, he is then enrolled in the elite Fieldston School on a scholarship.
This dual existence at Fieldston is the paradox that sharpens his intellectual blade. He is living in the rhythmic, multi-ethnic collision of the Bronx, yet he spends his days traversing the manicured halls of immense old money privilege. He isn't learning about wealth disparity as some abstract academic concept in a textbook. He is witnessing it through his daily commute.
So he's an outsider in Tennessee because of his race, and now he's an outsider at Fieldston because of his class.
Exactly. And that double alienation transformed him into a sociological spy. He is navigating these two distinct polarized worlds, and he starts writing. But he isn't writing to get good grades or satisfy academic requirements. He is writing because he has to process the dissonance. It's an absolute necessity for his mental survival.
Which brings us to a massive turning point in our deep dive, his evolution from a solitary writer into a revolutionary artist. He ends up at Lincoln University in Pennsylvania, and he goes there very deliberately to follow in the footsteps of Langston Hughes.
Right, seeking the origins of jazz poetry.
Yes. But what he actually finds at Lincoln is a crucial partnership with a musical prodigy from Brooklyn named Brian Jackson.
And it is essential that we frame their collaboration accurately. They did not merely form a band, they operated as a research unit.
A research unit. I love that framing.
It's the only way to describe it. Brian Jackson possessed this extraordinary fluidity on the piano. He was deeply fluent in the harmonic structures of jazz and the rhythmic imperatives of funk. Together, in those practice rooms at Lincoln, they meticulously deconstructed the music of their day. They were engineering a sound heavy enough to carry the immense weight of their political reality.
But the ultimate catalyst that locks this new sonic architecture into place happens in 1968. He goes to a civil rights rally in Harlem and witnesses a performance by the Last Poets. Now, for context, the Last Poets were formed on Malcolm X's birthday, right in the immediate aftermath of Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, and they are delivering this raw, percussive poetry over nothing but conga drums.
That specific performance fundamentally altered Gil Scott-Heron's understanding of the medium. The Last Poets demonstrated that language could be weaponized in the streets. He realized that poetry did not require a gentle melody, it required rhythm.
Right, rhythm over melody.
By marrying the spoken word to a relentless percussive foundation, you could bypass the intellect entirely. The message wouldn't just make you think, it would strike directly at your nervous system. They proved that poetry could function as a blunt instrument.
And this is fascinating because at the time, he is actively writing serious literature. He publishes 2 highly complex novels. You have The Vulture in 1970, which deals with the drug trade and corrupt policing in Harlem, and then The Nigger Factory in 1972, which is this dense campus novel analyzing a student uprising at a historically black college. So if you're already a published author, why pivot so hard into music?
Because despite the undeniable literary merit of those books, he recognized a critical flaw in the medium itself. Books were simply too slow. He looked around at a world that was actively burning down in the late 60s and early 70s, and he realized he needed a delivery mechanism that traveled at the speed of a riot.
The speed of a riot.
Exactly.
That urgency leads him to legendary producer Bob Thiele, who ran the independent jazz label Flying Dutchman Records. Thiele offers him an opportunity to record, but there's a catch. It's strictly within the confines of a very limited budget. They don't have the money to hire a full band. But this financial limitation actually inadvertently gives birth to the stark aesthetic of his revolution.
It's a perfect example of constraint creating genius. That aesthetic is captured on his 1970 debut, Small Talk at 125th, and Lenox. Now, that recording is often romanticized in pop culture as a live club date, but the forensic truth is far more calculated.
It wasn't a club at all.
No. It was recorded in a studio with a small, invited audience specifically to simulate that atmospheric energy. The instrumentation featured only his voice and 3 percussionists playing congas and bongos.
And that stripped-down, aggressive sound leaves absolutely no room for the listener to evade the message.
None. There was no horn section to soften the critique. There is no melodic bass line to hide behind. It is just rhythm and unvarnished truth. And this was the exact environment that produced the initial drum-heavy version of The Revolution Will Not Be Televised.
Which was a massive wake-up call.
It serves as his first major warning. From his artistic viewpoint, it was a blistering critique of consumer culture and media passivity. He was diagnosing a population that he saw as completely sedated by corporate imagery.
But he doesn't stay in that purely acoustic space forever. As we look at his 1971 release, Pieces of a Man, we see the poet fully evolve into the musician. Bob Thiele secures the funding for a full ensemble. He brings in a cadre of absolute elite New York session players. You have Ron Carter on bass,
Purdie on drums.
Hubert Laws on flute, alongside Brian Jackson on piano.
The integration of these master musicians fundamentally changes the sonic landscape of his work. Let's look at the title track, Pieces of a Man. It is a lush, cinematic tragedy analyzing the profound dehumanization of labor. It chronicles the psychological collapse of a man who is laid off from his job.
It's heartbreaking to listen to.
It is, but what makes the recording devastating is his vocal performance. He is singing rather than speaking, and his voice is distinctly, intentionally imperfect. It wavers, it cracks. You can hear the sheer physical and spiritual exhaustion of a man breaking apart under the weight of the system.
That album also features the re-recorded definitive version of The Revolution Will Not Be Televised. Driven by Ron Carter's masterful, melancholic bass line and a deeply infectious groove, it transforms from a raw poetic warning into a heavily sampled generational anthem. And this really kicks off a decade of relentless, rigorous output. Between 1971 and 1980, he dropped seminal works like Winter in America and Bridges.
And every single release from that era functions as a historical document, tracking the trajectory of what he viewed as the American dream's collapse. Take a track like The Bottle from the Winter in America album. It is a brilliant, devastating trap for the listener.
A trap in what way?
Well, he engineered a highly danceable, funky track that absolutely forces your body to move. But while you're moving, the lyrics meticulously detail the tragedy of a man drinking himself to death on the street corner. You are essentially dancing to a funeral. It perfectly reflects his genius for embedding heavy sociological observations inside incredibly accessible sonic structures.
During this fertile period, right around 1973, he becomes a central figure at the Nuyorican Poets Cafe on East 3rd Street. This venue serves as a vital laboratory for the spoken word movement. It fosters this dangerous electric feedback loop between the artists and the audience.
The environment of the Nuyorican was uncompromising. The room was thick with cigarette smoke. The crowds were not passive. They were actively engaged, shouting back at the stage, demanding absolute authenticity. If you were fake, they would let you know immediately.
No room for error.
None. This arena validated his unapologetic approach. He proved there was a massive appetite for poetry that refused to be polite. And in doing so, he and his contemporaries at the cafe laid the actual architectural foundation for what would eventually become conscious hip-hop.
But we have to talk about the toll this takes. Despite the critical acclaim, the constant touring, and high-profile appearances like Saturday Night Live, the reality was that he was still operating on modest, independent label budgets. The immense pressure to continually produce these profound cultural diagnoses led him to seek relief. He began using cocaine recreationally, a decision that would eventually consume his life.
And the true dissolution begins when his critical anchor is lost. In 1980, his partnership with Brian Jackson dissolves.
That was a massive blow.
It was. Without Jackson's structural and harmonic grounding, Gil Scott-Heron finds himself entirely adrift. The following years are marked by extreme inconsistency. After the release of Moving Target in 1982, an agonizing 12-year studio silence falls over his career. He becomes trapped in the shadow of his own legend, battling a severe addiction that drains his finances and systematically erodes his health.
He does reemerge briefly in 1994 with the album Spirits, and there's a track on there, Message to the Messengers, which is a direct lecture to the young rap artists who were heavily sampling his catalog at the time. He challenges them to take responsibility for their platform, reminding them that they are the new leaders of the dialogue. It's this brilliant flash of his original fire.
It was a beautiful moment of clarity, but unfortunately, the ensuing decade was defined by profound darkness. The 2000s saw a series of drug-related arrests, ultimately leading to his incarceration at Rikers Island. And the brutal irony here is inescapable. The man who wrote the song The Prisoner, who spent his entire life critically deconstructing the American penal and systemic apparatus, was now physically trapped within it.
In 2008, he publicly reveals that he is HIV positive. And visually, the toll by this point is staggering. He is a frail, gray, toothless figure. He looks as though he has lived 3 lifetimes. Yet, despite the physical decay, the core of his defiance remains entirely intact.
This is a crucial point in our deep dive. He fundamentally refused the mantle of the victim. When he was standing before the judicial system, he articulated to the judges that he was a man in deep pain, struggling with a disease, not a criminal. He wore his flaws like armor. He never apologized for his existence, maintaining an uncompromising posture against the systems he analyzed right to the bitter end.
Which brings us to his final artistic act. In 2010, Richard Russell, the head of Excel Recordings, tracks him down to a small apartment in Harlem. Russell had grown up revering Pieces of a Man, and he constructs this stark industrial blues landscape for Gil to inhabit on the album I'm New Here.
And I'm New Here sounds like a tomb. It is haunting. Surrounded by minimalist electronic beats, his voice, which has been completely ravaged by time, smoke, and struggle, grinds like tectonic plates.
It's so visceral.
Listen to his rendition of Robert Johnson's Me and the Devil. He transforms the Delta blues standard into a terrifying electronic stomp. And on the track, New York is Killing Me, accompanied by a hand clap that strikes like a gunshot, he confronts the very city that simultaneously built his legend and destroyed his body. It was a masterful, haunting, final testament.
Looking at this from our vantage point now in 2026, the vault of his legacy just continues to yield these profound insights. We have his posthumous 2012 memoir, The Last Holiday, which details his exhaustive efforts alongside Stevie Wonder to establish Martin Luther King Jr. Day. And just recently, for Record Store Day in April 2026, we saw the deluxe release of his 1981 album, Reflections.
And listening to Reflections today is a genuinely eerie experience, specifically the Track B movie. The piece was originally a spoken-word attack on the nostalgia-driven politics of actor-turned-president Ronald Reagan. However, from an analytical standpoint, if you substitute Reagan's name with any modern demagogue, his sociological critique remains perfectly intact.
It maps perfectly onto the present.
It really does. He diagnoses a population that he views as actively choosing entertainment over truth, hungering for a fabricated past. Regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum, his artistic viewpoint captures the exact mechanics of how political nostalgia operates today.
He famously explicitly rejected the title Godfather of Rap. He didn't want that label at all. Instead, he viewed his methodology as that of a black box retriever. He was a reporter and a historian who willingly walked into the burning building of Western society to retrieve the unvarnished data of what went wrong. He saw himself as a critical bridge in a long continuum, connecting the ancient oral traditions of West African griots directly to our digital future.
And this brings us to the ultimate synthesis of his life's work. The true tragedy is not just that his physical life ended in 2011 after a brutal struggle with addiction. The lasting tragedy is that we are still inhabiting the precise world he diagnosed. The structural inequalities, the media passivity, the mechanical hatred from his perspective, it is all still functioning exactly as he recorded it. We are still sitting passively, waiting for a television screen to deliver our liberation.
He warned us repeatedly that the revolution would be live. And by that, he meant that systemic change requires active physical participation in our own minds and in our streets. You can't just consume the revolution, you have to enact it.
Which brings us to the lingering question for you to explore as you process his archive today. He went into the fire, he retrieved the data, he left you the map, and he left you the manual for your own intellectual liberation. The question is, do you have the courage to actually read it, or will you just keep listening to the static?
Thank you for listening to the Golden Gems podcast. We'll be back next time with another deep dive. Until then, keep exploring, keep listening, and keep celebrating the power of uncompromising voices.